Hey there, welcome back to my YouTube channel. Today I want to talk to you about my top 10 tips for conducting documentary interviews. Oftentimes, really great documentaries are driven by very personal, strong, revealing interviews. So the challenge is how do you get somebody to feel comfortable enough and open up to you and give you those moments that are really going to make a powerful difference in the story that you're telling. But without care and thought going into the preparation of an interview, they can often end up flat and opportunities can be lost. So basically today, what I want to share with you is my top 10 tips for capturing intimate, soulful, long-form interviews, ones that have the opportunity to dig deeper and get to the heart of what's going on with your character. So tip number one is the pre-interview. So this can basically be done by phone or by Zoom. I was recently working on a project telling the story of an individual whose career was at their peak in the 70s and 80s. And so when I went on to do my research, I discovered there really wasn't much on the internet about them. The main body of their career had been pre-internet. So I basically did about an hour and a half pre-interview with the subject and her daughter.
All of her project.
Yeah, Chan's Dynasty. And was able to really glean an incredible amount of information and just kind of go through her career and find out all the details that I needed to. And it did a great job of just, breaking the ice and demystifying what was to come. So you may not always have the opportunity to pre-interview a person. So, in that case, what you do is you glean as much information about what their expertise is and the context of the individual, a start point to get a conversation rolling with them, and they'll feel like you at least know what they're all about or what their craft is about. So any opportunity to create a connection to get the ball rolling is what you want to do. Okay, so tip number two, have your story in mind. So basically what I mean by this is begin to work out or map out a story arc based on the conversation that you've had with your interviewee. So if you do have the opportunity to chat with them, start to look for motivations, catalysts, ups and downs, peaks and valleys, things that offer dramatic shifts in the story, but also things that obviously had an impact on that individual so that when you are interviewing them, you know what some of those highs and lows are that you might be able to move into in your interview to get them to start to express that on a very personal and emotive level, as opposed to just, reading the facts. Because really what you want to do is move away from a literal telling of the events and more to channeling back into that person's story and how it made them feel. So you're able to kind of peel away the literal surface events and start to mine the personal and the emotive world that those situations elicited for that individual. And those things start to become more universal and more emotionally powerful for the viewer to connect with and empathize with. Try your best to start to piece, even on a very broad level, broad strokes level, what those kind of life events and shifts and things that have led up to where this character is now, whether it's story of, personal triumph, maybe it's, somebody's career has suddenly taken off and how'd they get there, or maybe it's somebody who was in an incredible accident and they've overcome the injuries and now they've gotten themselves back in the world and back on their feet, or whatever that journey is that person is dealing with or has come through. Those are the things you want to try to get a sense of what those are before you go into the interview. So essentially you can tap into that and bring that story out in its most rich and deep way. And the idea there is to basically just be as prepared as you can when you go in and help guide the interview. Because part of what you're doing is you're laying the groundwork for a story to unfold. And oftentimes people don't tell their stories in a dramatically structured fashion. They just kind of tell what happened. But if you're able to create an architecture through a series of questions that lead the person from point to point, you can really help guide the storytelling process through the way in which you organize the questions. So that basically leads us to tip number 3, preparing your questions. So basically the idea here is that you're going to formulate a series of questions, and these questions are going to be designed in a way that will help the interviewee tell their story in a linear and logical fashion, one that gives them the opportunity to tell their story and let it unfold and build in a dramatic way. So you're basically reverse engineering the questions to elicit the story that you already know, as well as exploring further into areas that you're discovering as you go. So I recommend having those questions build to certain areas that you want to land on dramatically, giving yourself time to essentially warm that person up to you and allow them to get comfortable so that when you do get to those more delicate points in the interview, if they exist, they're ready to share that with you. Okay, tip number 4. So this is an interesting one. Is basically decide what time vantage point, what tense you want this interview to be in. Because there's when you're speaking with the person, that doesn't, and they're telling their story, it doesn't necessarily mean that it's the time tense that you want the film itself to be in. So the question to ask yourself is, what tense do you want the audience to be watching the film in? Do you want them to be experiencing that backstory or that reflection in real time? Are you going to be doing maybe reenactments so that we're trying to put the audience in the moment? Or are we looking back in time and talking about past tense? I had a situation as well recently where we were filming in a live venue and it was very loud, and I wanted to get some little short snippet interviews, but it was too loud. So I had to come back a day later, but I wanted to merge the two together so we felt like we were there that night. And so I asked the interviewees to speak as if the show was that night, not the previous night. And it worked great. It blended perfectly in the final film, but these are things you definitely want to track on so that once you get into the editing room, those interviews are kind of happening from the right time perspective that you want to express in the film itself. All right, so if you want a bonus tip, I'm going to throw an extra one in at the end, so stick around. And let's get into tip number 5. All right, so tip number 5 may seem a little bit dry, but it's really, really important. And it's basically get a talent release signed. And you want to do this before you do the interview. You can do it on the day. You're there, there's the energy of it, it's going to happen. And generally nobody wants to just not sign a release and then put the whole production to a halt. But you do want to do it before the interview. And the reason being is that once somebody sits down and starts to chat and they kind of open up, they can say things that they're not expecting to say, even if it's kind of stuff that later you decide, okay, that's off the record, but they can become super self-aware about that and get them really nervous to sign the release after the interview. So definitely recommend having them sign a talent release beforehand. Once you get that talent release signed, look at it and make sure they actually signed it, gave their signature in the area that they needed to. I did a project once where I was doing a bunch of interviews on the day, and everybody handed in their releases. I looked at them at the end of the day and found that there was one person that conveniently did not sign right where they were, and it was actually one of the guys was a lawyer, and I was like, he didn't sign. So keep an eye on those things because these are really important in the long run. So tip number 5, get a talent release signed. All right, tip number 6. This is the first thing we do once the cameras are rolling. And it's also a bit of business, kind of dry, but also really important downline. And it's essentially when you start shooting, before you just start doing the actual interview, have the person say their name and then also spell their name for you. And this isn't for use in the actual interview, but it's for reference. And 2 things. One, if people often pronounce their names differently than what it looks like. Mine's spelled Jacob, but I pronounce it Jakob. So it gives you the opportunity to get on the record how they like to hear their name, how their name is pronounced. And then you have them spell it. And that also puts it right there on the record for the editor if you're not editing it, but you're giving it to somebody so that they, if they're putting in, lower thirds or different title graphics or credits, there's a reference point for exactly how that person wants their name spelled as well. And then as well, ask them what their official title is or role and what they do. So that when you're doing also lower thirds or titles, you can make sure that that's accurate and is in tune with the way they want it to be presented. So that's a basic piece of business, but it's also one that's really helpful downline. Okay, so tip number 7 is also a little piece of interview business, a little technique that you want to incorporate as you're asking questions to people. And that is to incorporate the question in their response. So you might ask, how old were you when you started driving? And that person might naturally respond, 17. But, you're back in the editing room and you have a person going 17 and you're like, what does that have to do with anything? And so what you want to have that person do is essentially go, I started driving when I was 17. So essentially incorporate your question into their answer. For some people, it's a little trickier to wrap their head around, but if you can give them an example like the one I just did, they'll be like, oh, okay, I get that. And it might take them a little while to get the rhythm of that. But listen for it, because answers that don't have context, especially if you don't want to have your question in the interview, but you just want it to be standalone with that individual, you might not even be able to use their response if the context isn't there. So tip number 8 is also kind of a funny one, and it's one that feels really weird to do, and it's essentially when you're interviewing somebody, you may feel compelled to respond, like going, uh-huh, or oh, wow, or, react to what they're saying. And it's very alien to not do that, to just kind of be quiet while somebody might be saying something fairly dramatic or fairly exciting and compelling. But of course, the problem is you don't want your voice to end up being recorded in the shot. So what you have to train yourself to do is essentially really express your connection with them through your expressions. But, be in the moment. Eye contact is great. And really just, a lot of it's nodding and just showing them that you're their audience, you're present, you're completely absorbing every word they say, but doing it in a way where you are just totally silent. So now we are at tip number 9. We're closing in on the final tips. This one is really going to get more into your own creative process. And that is essentially listening for the unexpected, listening for what the new information, the information that you weren't prepared for. Have something like a small notepad, have some paper and pen right by you, because something might get said that you want to follow up on. You just want to get some quick notes, because more information will come. And if you don't write that down real fast, it may just totally go out of your head. So try to give yourself real quick little notes as things come in that you want to follow up on, or if you see connections with other things that are going on in the interview. And listen as well for themes, subtexts, things that can actually inform locations or that you might want to go to with that person, other scenes that could be shot to put you into the world of that person, especially if you start your project with an interview where you're laying the groundwork through their story. And that's going to start giving you the foundational information and story building blocks to start thinking about the dramatic scenes that you want to shoot, or the visual scenes and B-roll and additional scenes to support that in a more cinematic, filmic way. So tip number 10 is basically direct and sculpt the interview. And what I mean by that is that what you want to make sure is, as you're moving through this entire interview, and it might be an hour-long interview, 2-hour-long interview, and it also might be your only opportunity to interview this person, what you want to make sure is that you are getting all of your story beats. You want to be able to walk away from that interview and be able to present a cohesive story that hit all those points that you went into hoping to get. Some people are great storytellers. Some people are very shy. Some people are you turn the faucet on and the words just come flying out. Other people, it's really hard to pull stuff out of them. But what you want to do is really listen for what's coming at you. And if things are muddy or unclear, or maybe somebody's gone on a little bit too long, they set it up, but then they went down another track and then they finally got back to it. You want to listen for those types of situations and ask people, can we pull that into, say, two, 3, 4 sentences? Can we say that again, but in a more succinct way? And if there are key moments that you need to, like, say, bridge gaps between one idea and the next, give them a prompt. You'll be super happy you did. If you're still here, you've gotten through 10 tips. If you like what you've been hearing, hit the like button, subscribe, hit the old bell for notifications. I'd super appreciate it. Thank you for watching to this point. And now let me give you the bonus tip. tip number 11. Sometimes people will say, hey, can I see your interview questions? And basically the bonus tip is don't show your interview questions. And the reason for this is that I was in a situation once where I was working with a client. The client was doing interviews, but we had formulated the questions together. And the interviewee had asked the client, hey, can I see the questions? And they felt no harm in that. And they were not super experienced in doing interviews. So, they just innocently let that individual look at those questions. However, what ended up happening is upon the first question, that person had all the questions in their head and just blasted out all the answers to every single question. It was all just like a machine gun fire of information. We had to kind of regroup and reset the whole thing. But essentially it took the spontaneity out of the situation. It made it, all those nerves got just bundled up by, in the interviewee. And so they just launched all that information out, and it just made for a really challenging interview situation. So what I recommend is that if people are curious or nervous and they want to see the questions, is give them a kind of top view description of what you're going to hit on, just enough information so that they know what they're getting into. That's the bonus tip. Tip number 11, hold those questions close to your chest so that you can be the director and you can be the guide that is, essentially shepherding the story forward. So the documentary art form is just amazing in my book. They allow us to experience the lives of others and walk in someone else's shoes for just a moment. If you are able to create a safe and trusting environment, a well-prepared interview can really tap into deep human storytelling and can often lead to unexpected insights into your character and story. Through words and questions, you're basically mining a human story. You're digging deeper. And if you work your way into those murky, dark areas, you will often find surprising, revealing stories about the human condition. So dig deep and treat your subject's story with care and sensitivity, and you'll be rewarded with material you never imagined was sitting right there in front of you. All right, well, thanks so much for sticking around, and I do hope you found this useful. If you did, please like and subscribe to the channel. And if you do have any questions or comments or want me to elaborate on any of these tips in future videos, just let me know in the comments below. And for now, good luck with your project, and I'll see you in the next one.